Ще раз доброго вечора.
Good evening to you all. It is a pleasure to see so many people on this Friday night willing to come here for the last event of the...
So my name is Sofia Dyak, and I represent the Center for Urban History, one of the organizers of this event. Now it's time to switch to Ukrainian.
So tonight we had a very busy day. Allow me to summarize this day and try to describe where we are now, to have these concluding remarks. During the whole day we have discussed different extremes, different ideas and places. We were traveling around among the things that were happening 100 years ago in 2018-19. We were talking about the post-imperial aspects in Eastern Europe, and also we talked about the post-war stage, about the notions of justice and the post-war justice and law. We were trying to present a broader context for life and intellectual activities and experiences of the two lawyers who used to study in Lviv, even though they were not born in Lviv, but they did their law degree in Lviv. Previous discussion brought us to the late 20th and the early 21st century, and it brought us to the world of ideas, how ideas correlate with the practice. And in these concluding remarks, we are getting back to the city we are in, the idea of how to conclude this agenda that is revolving around the commemoration of legacies of the lawyers Herr Schlauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin. We were trying to bring in the city the way Philippe sensed it in his book. The city is one of the protagonists of the bulk of this story. We're not sure whether this is the positive or the negative character. Therefore, we shall try to talk about this tonight. The book that was published last year and tried to promote not only the lawyers but the city itself for the numerous audiences. Many people learned about the city, or at least they were reminded about the city of Lviv. And in Lviv, we had the Ukrainian translation of the book coming out, and more people, therefore, learned about the personalities that have become prominent in the international law and in the post-war world, with the ideas of the civilized world and a humane attitude. And these people are related to Lviv. And this could be the first question we could take: how to be proud of these people. These are also the sons of our city. And being proud of that, we could, on the one hand, bring back the knowledge on something that was little known or not very much known or known in a different way. But on the other hand, there is a risk that in commemoration and celebration of their achievements, we might ignore or miss out on the opportunity to talk about the history of our city in an open way, in a critical and sensitive way. It was not only the city that inspired people to design their intellectual concepts, but this is also the place and the city where crimes against humanity and genocides were taking place, in the streets, in the houses, and in the yards of the city. This is the city that faced the crucial change of the population. When we talk about the individual stories, personal stories, memories, reminiscences, records. These are the things that we still know very little about, and it is even less represented in such places as museums or in the training processes at schools. How far is it possible to open up and to be proud of something, but also this could be an opportunity to develop a more adequate perception of our own city and the material environment, the city that has not been destroyed, but actually several hundreds, thousands of lives were destroyed and exterminated in this city, from killings to deportations. These are very general topics, of course, but also this is another opportunity for us to discuss it. The examples that I would like to mention to conclude my brief introductory speech is the sample of another person, not a lawyer. And this person is Stanislav Lem, who was born in Lviv and survived the war in Lviv. He rejected the invitation to come to Lviv several times. He received these invitations back in the 1990s and in the early 2000s. But we could presume he had a reason not to be willing to come back to Lviv. He claimed it was like returning to a woman who now lives already with a different husband and has different children. This is the city that has remained in the past. But the recent studies that were published several years ago shed more light on something that he was so loudly silent about. Stanislav Lem survived the pogrom in Lviv in the Brigitki courtyard. He was staying in this prison together with the Jewish people who were caught around the Horodotska street. He stayed in this courtyard of the prison after he had to take out the bodies of the prisoners who were killed after the Soviet army had to recede. He was sitting there and waiting for his own death because these people were later shot down. But due to some serendipity or coincidence, he managed to survive, and then he left as a Polish citizen for Poland. In the 1970s, a book, The Return of the Stars, written by him, was published in Lviv about some astronauts going to the outer space, and they come back after 100 years. And here on the Earth, everyone is happy because they invented the way to avoid conflicts. This book was translated into the Ukrainian language in Lviv in the 1970s, and this is the story which shows us the signals, but we fail to understand what he really meant because we don't have the conversation going on about the painful things, about murders, killings, about being engaged in the killings, about the fact that local citizens and the Ukrainian rescue and the police and the local authorities were engaged in committing the crimes that our lawyers described later. And making this introduction, I would like to start the conversation going about the possibilities of balancing between the celebration of the prominent personalities and their achievements and to be proud of them. But on the other hand, we are balancing between the situations when we have to admit some of the things that we don't feel comfortable about. And to start with, I would like to invite Dr. Iryna Starovoit from the Ukrainian Catholic University, who used to write a lot, and she used to speak a lot and will be speaking, writing about the discrepancy as an interruption in the memories and the need to remember in the city.
Сьогодні ми прийшли говорити також
Today
про
we're
цю книгу,
about to
яку
discuss
Філіп
also the book that
Сенс
Philippe
нам усім
Sens
подарував.
has given us, and which was published in Ukrainian a few months ago, this East-West Street, Return to Lviv, in its Ukrainian translation. I think those of you who have read it know that you've been missing this book. We modern-day Lvivians, we live in a great town, we know this. But we also live in a very tragic place, in a beautiful, tragic place. You can be proud of something that we've achieved, that we've inherited. It's important that this town, we haven't fully understood it. We haven't fully inherited it yet. There was a great silence about who was here before us. And I would just like to remind us again that, back in 1944, this town ceased to exist. It was almost like a neutron bomb. It started over again. The walls, the hardware, the buildings are 90% undamaged in this horrible war. But the people, the residents, died or were deported. Also, up to 90% of the people who lived here either died or were deported. And so the question is, are we good legators? Are we good inheritors? Are modern-day Lvivians good inheritors? Well, it's good to inherit something that is a happy legacy, that is a happy inheritance, something that we can truly be proud of. It's much harder to identify with the negative aspects of the past, to accept that which was there before you, that you, on the one hand, can't control, but somehow you have to deal with. Something that later you have to take responsibility for, because inheritance is not just, reaping the fruits. It's also what will we do with our legacy, and how will we pass it on. Josef Roth, who has many times stayed in this place as a correspondent, who knew much about Lviv, about Lembag in the early 20th century, here in Lviv, and writing his essay Lembag die Stadt, and wrote that cities survive the languages and the customs of their builders. Lviv has managed to survive the languages and customs of its builders several times, and never before has Lviv been as homogeneous as it is now. It has never been dominated by a single language, a single nation, and more or less a single worldview. However, starting from the late Soviet times, when you could come here, when the Western scholars could come here, and when their initial comments started appearing and their reportage started appearing of what they saw here, both Polish and American and Canadian visitors almost always observed an important aspect for themselves that was very offensive to me as a reader. They said that the town was great, but the people didn't fit. And so many years later, about 40 years later, and people still don't quite fit. And I ask myself, why? And I think that if we look back, look at the work with memory and work with history that started here in the late 80s, it's very often the work with memory in a national bottle. How do we tell the story of Lviv as if it was always a Ukrainian town? How do we tell the story of Lviv so that we go back to the past, but only to the extent that it works for us, right? To a glorified, purified Austria that gave us enlightenment and equal opportunity and education, at least to all the young men in the area. Talk about Ivan Franko, who got a new lease on life. Ivan Franko, on the university where he studied, the Lviv University, he wrote on this university that back in his student years, this university was not exactly a stellar place for education. And I think maybe even a few decades later, it wasn't that either, at least not in all the areas. I know it had several good professors, because it had Professor Hajdukevich. Because of Professor Hajdukevich, later it had the Lviv Mathematics School, or later the Lviv Warsaw Philosophical School. Because it had one good professor, Makarevich, he taught many students, probably not just Lemkin and Lauterpacht. He probably taught, but it's interesting that it's them, even though they never met in this town. And as Philippe says, maybe they never met ever anywhere at the same place in their whole the duration of their whole life. But it's funny that, as Professor Mikhail Rudnitsky joked about this already under Soviet domination, he said when one of the students expressed an interesting opinion, he said, "Young man, wear a hat." Because ideas have a way of jumping to different heads. So we can say that this town was in a sort of a collective of extremely intelligent, extremely interesting thinking people who attempted to be far-reaching and far-seeing, who tried to be useful for their time and their setting. And so now, in talking about the past and about the past that we touch upon in this conference, in these walls of this Rathaus, of this city council, something that we'll be discussing many years in the future, this is a past that is not fully past. So, because we're talking about, it's like we're getting retrospective news, right? For many of you, the things that you've been hearing over the past few years in Lviv, it's news. This hasn't been mentioned in the papers, right? When in the early 90s or in the early 2000s, these are still discoveries for this town of yours, this town you call home, this town that you own, that you call your own. But how do we reach justice in our relationship with the recent past? Now, whereas the lawyers are concerned with living in a more just world, is this justice only prospective? Is it only future-oriented, or can we look into this? Can we only achieve this justice in the future when we, at least to the extent of our capacity, also reach for justice in our relationship with the past? So I think that Lemkin and Lauterbach did whatever they could to leave our world a more just, safe, and humane place. Now the question is to us: did we do all we could? And I think we're still a bit of a fishbowl or aquarium in an ocean. We're floating, and this town that calls itself open to the world, it floats toward integration, Europe, westernization, the broader world. But really, in opening itself to the world, this town opened itself also to many genealogical pilgrims, to many stories that will come back, and that will be will not be sweet and sugary nostalgia, but that will be the bitter reality. And so the question is, if you can build identity, construct identity around nationality, we should probably construct identity around towns as well, particularly these vibrant, living towns that Lviv is endeavoring to be. Now, we should mention that Lauterbach didn't stay here. He moved to the capital of his country, to Vienna, at the time. Lemkin didn't stay here. He went to the capital of his country at the time, to Warsaw. I think there's a lot of work in this town. It's aimed at take a step back from this mobility, so that not all the best people leave Lviv after they get their education or after they spent their childhood and young years here. To an extent, we're succeeding. But we're only succeeding to an extent. Now, in order for us to be able to think about the future of this town as a town that matters, that is on the map even beyond Ukraine, we have to remember the identity of the residents, of the people who built, who made the city, who lived their lives here, and particularly those people who weren't allowed to live out those lives that they had perhaps intended to here. A professor at Harvard, Ukrainian, at the Harvard University, Ukrainian student Hrigory Hrabovich, he said, in my dad's idea, I was supposed to have been born in Lviv. We should remember those who were supposed to have been born here but never were. We should be very mindful of those who are in the mass graves here, who were supposed to live here. Perhaps even we weren't supposed to live here, but they were supposed to have some kind of continuation, but they don't now. It so happens that we're their only continuation. If we don't authorize this memory, if we don't validate, don't accept it as our own, this memory will lose a human connection and human care, and that will be inhumane. Thank you. Thank you.
Наступною хотіла б запросити до слова
And the next speaker I would like to invite to take the floor is Professor Norman Davies, the Professor Emeritus of the University in London and also in Oxford, and also the author of the books that were translated into many languages, one of the thickest books that were also published in Ukrainian, The History of Europe. It was one of the major revelations since the late 1990s. But the book and the experience I would like you to share about. Well, you were writing the history of the city, which is very often related and connected to Lviv. This is the city of Wroclaw. This is the city with the divisions, with the disrupted period of 1945. Many people from Lviv were forced to leave to this city. And this is also the city that is trying to develop its more adequate and more sensitive attitude to the past for the last 20 years. Very often it is also the model for Lviv. Different kind of model, of course. Welcome.
Yes, it's working. Thank you for the kind words. My first thought is that cities which change their identity are very numerous. Lviv is by no means an exception. In fact, if you take the long view, cities changing their identity is almost the norm. London started life as a Roman city where not a single person spoke English. In fact, the English nation had not yet been invented. The two main cities of Scotland were founded by the Welsh. And if you go there, they have no idea about it. Dublin was founded as a Viking settlement of invaders, people who came in from the sea with no connection with the local Irish. And so you can go on. Istanbul has not always been Istanbul. For centuries it was Greek-speaking Christian Constantinople. If we're in the 20th century, of course, this part of the world, having suffered many traumatic events, has produced a large crop of cities that have changed their identity, who in many cases have changed their inhabitants, exchanged their inhabitants. And Lviv is obviously in this category. The chairman's kind enough to mention my study of Wrocław. And Wrocław in Western Poland is very closely the partner city of Lviv, in that they have a common history. If there is anywhere in the world which is the reincarnation of Polish Lviv, it is Wrocław. The second thing that I thought I should talk about is multiple identities. We often hear generalizations that, let's call it Lemberg. Lemberg was inhabited by three main communities. The majority Polish, the second in number Jewish, and the third Ukrainian, or as they said in those days, Ruthenians. And it's easy to think of these three groups as completely different planets, each with their religion, their language, their traditions, and so on. But if you look closely, you'll find that the boundaries between the three communities were pretty fuzzy. They were overlapping, and for a number of reasons. For one thing, there were a large number of mixed marriages. It was quite possible, quite encouraged by the clergy, for Roman Catholics to marry Greek Catholics, especially in the countryside. Quite often, young women married from a Ruthenian village would marry men from a Roman Catholic village nearby. And in the same way, Polish Roman Catholic women would marry into Greek Catholic villages. The effect was that those people were completely bi-ethnic. Biologically, they were mixed up. They may have lived in separate villages, but the fathers and mothers were mixed together for generations. Similarly, if we're talking of the Jewish community, there was a long history, especially in the 19th century, of assimilation, whereby different Jewish communities, again, we shouldn't talk of one Jewish community, there was quite a large number. But over the decades of the 19th century, many Jews assimilated into the dominant language and culture, so that Polish became, in the city, if not everywhere in the region, the principal language with which Jews exchanged how they talk with each other. But more than that, there was quite a substantial number of Jewish people who married into the Catholic community. So that there was a lot also, as it were, in the sector of the intelligentsia, people who had left their religion but had adopted the dominant Polish culture. So far had this assimilation gone, and it's difficult to know exactly how far it gone, but when the Holocaust came, and you look in detail, for example, at the Warsaw Ghetto, or the ghetto in Lviv, there were whole districts in the ghetto, the Jewish ghetto, reserved for Catholics. There were whole churches, Christian churches, where the clergy and the congregation were Jewish according to Nazi laws, racial laws, but culturally they were actually Polish and Catholic. And you tend not to think of this. These were human beings with very complicated connections, and in a city like Lemberg, you can't really talk of three clean-cut, separate communities. These people with different languages, different religions, different traditions, had been mixed up in many ways for a long time. And we should remember this. The distinction between Pole and Ukrainian and Jew was not very clear at all. So the last thing is who, or grammatically, whom should we celebrate? The answer is all of them. There's no reason to exclude distinguished individuals because of their race, their religion, or their connections. We've heard the last couple of days a lot about these distinguished lawyers who often had strong Jewish connections. But there's all sorts of others we haven't even talked about. I don't think we've yet mentioned the name, Stefan Banach, the mathematician, one of the leading mathematicians of the 20th century, the founder of functional analysis, about which I can't say any more at all. But I'm a historian. there was a whole school of historians from Lemberg. Szymon Ashkenazy, the leading Polish, wrote in Polish, diplomatic historian. Oswald Balca, historian of law. There are books about all these people, a lot of them literary people. Maria Konopnicka, Zbigniew Herbert, Stanisław Lem came up. We once actually lived in the house next to Stanisław Lem in Krakow. Great science fiction writer who has not, he never came back. You were telling about him, but by celebrating all the great sons and daughters of Lemberg, Lviv, Lvov, you will actually help to heal the divisions that have arose because of the historical traumas. Thank you.
І зараз я хочу запросити до слова
Philippe. I would like to give the floor to Philippe Sands, who is responsible at least for bringing back at least a few of these luminaries, but also to ask what are the expectations for the future? What effect do you expect your book to have, and whatever other comment you might want to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofia, and thank you, Office of the Mayor. I think if you had asked me 7 years ago, exactly, almost to the day, when I first set foot in this city of Lviv, or Lvov, or Lvov, or Lemberg, or Leopolis, or whatever you want to call it, that I'd be sitting here this evening, 7 years later, amongst many friends, actually, with members of the Lauterpacht family and the Lemkin family, talking about this extraordinary city and what it might do next, I would have said, no way. Why on earth would that happen? I came completely by accident to this city. I got an invitation to deliver a lecture on my work on crimes against humanity and genocide, invited both by the Ukrainian Catholic University and by the Ivan Franko University, and I accepted only because my grandfather happened to have been born in this city in 1904, and I just wanted to find the house where he was born. It was a book, it was a journey and a book about identity. It's about knowing who I was by knowing who my grandfather was. It's the same message that really Norman is talking about. So I happen now to be a person who has an English passport and a French passport, but a bit of me is Lvivian, and I always feel very at home when I come here. I didn't expect to write a book. I didn't come here thinking that I would. And it just sort of emerged because I found not only an extraordinary city, but also rather extraordinary human beings, students that I met in that first visit, who I still know today, who I've befriended, and who have helped me enormously with the research, for which I am intensely grateful. But listening to Norman, and what a pleasure it is to sit with you here, Norman, your story is absolutely right. I describe in the book how on the first visit, after the first seminar I gave at the Ivan Franko Law School, actually it's not the law school, it's the International Relations faculty, because, and this really irritates an English or French international lawyer, international law in this law school at Ivan Franko is not part of the law faculty. It's a sort of residue that it's not really law, so we'll put it in the International Relations Department and make it even more marginal than it is in the normal times. So one plea, what to do, please bring international law into the law faculty. But after that first seminar, a young woman came up to me and said, the story that you've just told, I gave a very brief exposition about Lauterpacht and Lemkin that I had just stumbled across completely by accident. She just said very gently, the story you've told means a lot to me personally. And I understood straight away what she was saying. She was saying to me in the most subtle of ways that she had, and I never asked which, either Polish background or Jewish background or Armenian background or some other background. And that was part of her identity. But I also understood that she didn't feel comfortable talking about it. And that was interesting. It's not the only place in the world where this happens. There are many places where this happens, including increasingly, I'm very sorry to say, in the country where I live, the United Kingdom. This is a feature of our modern world. But Sofia is right. Although the book that I wrote is essentially about four men, Lauterpacht, Lemkin, my grandfather Leon, whose house I found on Sheptytsky Street, and we mustn't forget Hans Frank, who came here in 1942 and sowed the seeds of terrible mischief, helped by a great number of people, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So it's about four men, and it's about two crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. Lauterpacht thought you should protect human beings as individuals. Lemkin thought you should protect human beings because they are a member of a group, and within that bifurcated path lies the whole of human identity and existence. It asks the question, who are we? Every single one of you sitting in this room will at some point, as I have and as we all do, ask oneself the question, who am I? How do I define myself? And how do I want the law to protect me? Perhaps the last question's a bit more amongst the lawyers, but it's essentially the same thing. It's basically saying, why am I worthy of protection? Am I worthy of protection just because I'm a living human being, or am I worthy of protection because I'm a member of a group that is entitled to protection, or both, or a combination of all of these things? These are issues of identity. But it's not just about four men, two crimes, it's also about one city, a remarkable place, the city of Lviv, on which Norman and Sofia and Iryna have already said much that has moved me and that is very, very powerful. And writing the book, I didn't expect the city to become a character, but it did, because I sort of fell in love with the place, despite the darkness, despite the horrors, because it is a special place. There is something captivating about it. And every single person I've brought to this city sort of walks around it and thinks, whoa, I didn't know anything about this place. I'd never heard of it. Why does no one talk about it? Why is it not on the map? It's really one of the great cities of Europe, and it's become forgotten. It was a forgotten, closed city for 50 years. Under the Soviet period, because it was a border city, people couldn't go. Norman, you told us you came for the first time in 1991. How incredible is that? And so you are in a place that is really off the beaten track, which is wonderful. There are no direct flights from London. That is both a nightmare. It is both a nightmare and a source of immense pleasure. I think, apart from the people I've brought, I've never met a single British person in Lviv except Ben, okay, who I met many times, who is living here. And that will no doubt change because the people are very welcoming, because the food is fabulous, because the city is beautiful, because it has the best coffee in the world. I think it is the coffee capital of the world, and because the travel will, over time, become easier. Since the book came out, I get a steady stream of emails of people sending me photographs of the book in front of one of the places that I've written about. I've probably had more than 200 emails like that. And so far the book's only been out in English, but it's just come out in Spanish, Italian, French, Ukrainian. It's coming out in 15 more languages. And so all of a sudden, it's going to be a boost, I hope, to your tourist industry, and you'll get direct flights, although I've got to say, Lviv is not a Ryanair city. Please do better than Ryanair, okay? It's at least an EasyJet city, okay? And it may one day be a British Airways city or some such like, but I hope that we don't only forever have to take Ryanair here. So people come, and they come armed with a book and other things, and they walk around, and they're all amazed about it. And yet, the point that was made by Iryna is about people not knowing about the city is not just British people, French people, American people, Chinese, Japanese, whoever's starting to come. It's Ukrainians who live here. The number of Ukrainians who've said to me, I had no idea what had happened here. It was not taught to us in schools. There are no books about it. It's not in the history curriculum. We know absolutely nothing about it. And the moment where that was most encapsulated for me was I was here 2 months ago. There was a big congress of PEN International, the Writers Association. And because of East-West Street, I was asked very kindly to give the opening address. And only when I arrived in Lviv a couple of days before did I discover where the opening address was going to take place, the opening of the Congress. And it was the aula of the Ivan Franko University, the wonderful great hall, which happens to be the same hall where Hans Frank spoke on the 1st of August 1942 and announced the mass murder of 100,000 people. So I found myself standing in exactly the same place as Hans Frank, exactly 75 years later, almost to the day. And I decided to put up a photograph of Frank speaking in the room at that moment. Some people, I think, were there. And the front row, it's a very large hall. There were maybe nearly 1,000 people there. And the front row was all the important people in the city. Mostly men, I have to say. And they sat there, and as I put the photograph up on the big giant screen, I saw people just go like this. You know, the mouths just opened. And I paused my lecture, which was a pre-written lecture, and said, I know, it's amazing, isn't it? Most people have no idea that in this room, the mass murder of 100,000 Poles and Jews was announced and then took place in the next 2 weeks. And then after the lecture, and subsequently, and it's happened again since I've been here on this visit, many people who were students have come up to me and said, God, we got our degree in that room, and we had no idea what had happened in that room. So the consequence has been, at least for some people, to open up a sense of memory. And there have been changes even since the book has come out. The book came out in May 2016, and it coincided with the beginnings of commemorating significant places. When I first arrived 7 years ago, there were no significant markers of places of significant interest in relation to the story that I've told. If you now go right round the corner from here up to the place of the former Golden Rose Synagogue, you'll see an extraordinary memorial garden with words from people who were once from this city, recognizing that they had spent time here. And there is the beginnings of something, and the city and the mayor's office has been absolutely, I think, courageous and fearless in beginning to deal with that kind of history. So that certainly the book has coincided with a change of consciousness, which I feel now every time that I come. I come to close with what might happen next. I'm reminded of an anecdote by one of my favorite teachers of international law, Professor Philippe of Cambridge University, who once said to a group of us, international law will only really be significant when taxi drivers are talking about it. About 10 years later, I received a letter from Philippe saying, "Dear Philippe, amazing. I took a taxi yesterday from King's Cross when I came down on the train from Cambridge, and I got into a taxi, and the taxi driver was reading your book, Lawless World, about Iraq and international law. So it's beginning to happen." That is not what I expect for Lviv. How do we see the future going? Well, we talked in the title about branding. One could imagine a Hirsch-Lauterpacht vodka, possibly, or a Raphael Lemkin beer, the genocide beer, or some such thing. But one can also imagine, I listened with great interest to my dear friend Sean Murphy, that one day there could be the Lviv Convention on Crimes Against Humanity. Why not? Why doesn't the government of the Ukraine say, this is the place where it should be finally negotiated and signed? That's something I think the mayor can play an important role in doing. Why not more commemorations of places? We're going to go on a walking tour tomorrow, and we're going to, well, the mayor will unveil plaques to 3 great international lawyers. Apart from Hirsch-Lauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin, also the great Louis Sohn, who lived here in the 1930s and who I was privileged to know. He's the only one of the 3, of course, that I met, and I sat in on his classes, and he became someone I knew quite well, and he was here in the 1930s. So those are steps in the right direction. We understand, even coming from London, the complexities of commemoration. I live in a country where there is no museum of colonialism. There is no museum of slavery. Britain invented the slave trade, and there is nothing. So silence is not something which this city, this country, this region has a monopoly over. Any community that has done or been through difficult times has tremendous difficulty in identifying that. And it's all the more so when you're a newly independent democracy. A country that's only truly had its democracy and independence for 25 years, understandably, you're still in that stage of struggling for existence and identity. And it's understandable that the first thing you're going to do is not necessarily put up plaques saying these terrible things happened in our country, oh, and by the way, some of our people were engaged in doing it. That perhaps will come later in time. But I think there is a need to memorialize some of the places where things happened. I published another tiny little book which is called City of Lions in English, published by the wonderful little Pushkin Press in the UK. It's not out in Ukrainian. I hope it will be. It was actually written in Polish.
book.
And it was called, when it was written by Joseph Witlin, Mój Lwów, My Lviv. And in it, he takes a walk through the city, and I follow 70 years later and identify many of the places, I'm afraid, where dark things happened to many different elements of the population. There have been, in the 20th century, discriminations against Ukrainians. I was describing that in the conference this afternoon when I finally found, with the help of Ivan Horodisky, the student papers from 1915 to 1926. One saw that there were a great number of Polish students enrolled at the Jan Kazimierz University, some Jewish students enrolled, but no Ukrainians almost, because they were effectively prohibited from coming to the university. So it's not about any community having a monopoly on horror or on perpetration or on victimhood. We know it's much more complex than that. but an honest accounting, which is now beginning with the memorial garden that has opened. Which brings me, I think, finally to the last thing I think something needs to happen about. One of the great buildings of this city, on which you won't find any plaque in relation to the role it played in my book, is the old law school building, which is less than a mile from here, a magnificent space in which both Lauterpacht and Lemkin took their lessons with Oswald Balzer, who we think of as a lawyer, not a historian. Battle over that. And Professor Makarevich and many other people. It's now the biology department. And it has in it an extraordinary museum, which dates back to the middle of the 19th century, of animals and insects and fish, and I put some photographs of it in the book. It's an incredible, completely incredible place, not open to the public, but you can ring and make an appointment and go. And you wander around the few rooms of this incredible collection and realize that it's very peculiar, that there is a museum about animals and insects and frogs and eggs and butterflies and large animals, but there's nothing about the people who used to live here. And so how one deals with that is obviously complex, but in a sense what Lviv needs is a museum of its 20th century, which honestly engages with the totality of the extraordinary rich life. But to end, I do think thanks are due to this mayor, to the community that is allowing us to be here today, to organizations like the Center for Urban History, to universities like the Ukrainian Catholic University and the Ivan Franko University, to lawyers like Professor Rabinovich, who's here tonight, who's been here for 50 years doing his stuff on human rights, largely in the shadows, but now all of a sudden emerging as people recognize what the legacy of this city is. So the fabric is incredibly rich. And I think you're going to speak next, and you'll tell us what some of your ideas are, but it's like putty in your hands. There is so much you can do with this city. And there is so much that I have to be grateful to for those people from this city who have opened themselves up and shown absolute hospitality to me over the last 7 years. So I end by saying to all of you here and to the Mayor's office and to Sofia, the biggest possible thank you for making this possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Я хочу запросити до слова Андрія Москаленка, заступника.
And now I would like to invite Mr. Andriy Moskalenko to take the floor. He is the deputy mayor of Lviv. The history of Lviv after 1991 has had several attempts to reconsider the branding of the city. We started with the Ukrainian Piedmont, and also it can still be found as a reference in different documents, the Ukrainian tradition, but we've heard increasingly more about innovations and creative industry in the last several years. We also know about the logo of the city, at Lviv open to the world. Therefore, I would like to ask you to share about the opportunities and the steps that you envision in terms of the vision of the municipality. These are probably the big steps and the small steps. Well, there are no small steps, all of them matter, but when the CEO of British Airways will read the book, we will send it to him, and more people will start coming here. What will we be able to tell to these people, and how will we be able to understand more?
Доброго вечора. Я думаю, що насправді, мабуть, чи не найбільшою цінністю нашого сьогодні
major value of this stay here tonight, there is this truth, like the idea has found its place. The idea that was born in Lviv the idea that used to travel around, develop, and suffer all around the world, in New York, in London, and many other places in the world, has finally reached its native place. And actually, it has become possible due to the philosophical idea and concept that Philippe suggested, and due to the huge efforts of Sofia and her colleagues. When I think about this discussion tonight and about the ideas mentioned, I came across a very interesting article. I'm trying to start from very far away to answer the question. So I came across a very interesting article of 1935 by Lancelot Lott that mentions the Ukrainian question. I will quote only two brief sentences. Like, over the last several months, Ukraine, that the West has not known about, found itself in the focus of the global attention. Most people know little or nothing about this country. This is not their fault, because the reason to this ignorance is very valid. The oppressors of Ukraine took a good care to keep this country unknown. They even negated its existence. It's very difficult to imagine anything which is worth of the condemnation. But the uncontrolled activities now also put Ukraine back to the international arena. In the times of despotism, only the true and real things would emerge and come through. The fact, the precedents that we are going to have tomorrow, when we will be unveiling the plagues, and possibly, well, this is not possibly, but it is going to be so. Not everyone knows that the concept of genocide was founded by the people who are related to this city. And the human rights concepts also have its roots in Lviv. This is going to be a precedent of a kind. And now I would also like to refer to Lviv again. Lviv is also a very important city for the entire country of Ukraine. In rough terms, we have been talking about the logo of the city, that we are trying to communicate this message through. 10 years ago, the vision was born that Lviv was open to the world because we wanted to open the city up. 10 years ago, no one would really take account of the tourists coming to the city. This market square was used as a parking lot, and you could hardly go through. Today, these are several millions of visitors who are coming every year. But when we talk about Kyiv, it is inevitably and undoubtedly the capital of the city, and as the Lviv city mayor, Mr. Starovoit, claims, this is the heart of Ukraine. But Lviv is the soul of Ukraine. Usually, soul has a function which is higher level than the formal or official things. If we take a look on the history of Ukraine, all of the key things were coming from Lviv, in fact. They were revolving and developing in Lviv. If we take a look on the structure of the population, some 15 to 20% are made up by the young, proactive people. These are the students. Today, we have a very important thing to mention, and this is something that opens up the opportunities. These are the opportunities not only for the British Airways to come, but for many others as well, who would help us to open up even more. There is a very interesting fact that cannot be ignored or taken for granted. The fact that these days Lviv witnesses the change of generations. This is not about the age generations. These are the mental generations and thoughtful generations who are able to think. Because all of us are here tonight and we are discussing the issues of a higher level. They are deeper in their nature. It's not only about doing things this way or the other. they're not even opening up the city as a, well, because everyone has its own Lviv. One person used to tell me some time ago, let me show you my own Lviv. And he took me along the narrow streets long time ago. I was really captivated. I learned so many interesting stories I have never read in school or at the university because I was not able to. They were not accessible. But the major value is that we do have our Lviv. Lviv that imposes a lot of responsibilities. If we take a look on the history of Lviv, the city has been suffering a lot. The city has been tried many times and has been challenged many times. And basically, the best way out would be to appreciate the people who used to live, who are living, and who will be living in this city. This is the major value. Getting back to the explanations of how Lviv communicates its message and promotes the brand, I believe we should focus on the people who used to be working and creating things here, who are doing this now and who will be doing this in the future. The biggest value is that we are all here tonight, that we are getting back to the contested history that would not always be possible to comprehend on the basis of one quote only. But this is the history that makes you think and gives you the impetus to reflect on many things, focusing on a human being who used to live here, will be living here, and is living here today. Thank you.
Це вже час завершувати нашу розмову, але я б хотіла, якщо хтось має щось бажання сказати коротко, не забирати
any brief remarks, try to grab this opportunity. You could raise your hand and go ahead. If there are no questions, well, this is not the end yet. Tomorrow, we shall meet again in the Philharmonics Hall. We are going to enjoy the performance, East-West Street, the Song of Good and Evil. I can see one hand raised.
Hello, my name is Christian Davies. I'm related to one of the panel members. I think at least one.
Gives you courage.
As a journalist based in Poland, obviously there are a lot of very similar discussions going on about coming to terms with history being a relatively homogenous nation but with a multicultural past and so on. And what you see there is that, unfortunately, a lot of the very good progress that was made over a very long time, over time created a backlash, that every attempt to enlighten people about the past or to come to terms with bad things that that happened there was rejected by people who are saying you're being ashamed of your history, or that they don't want to know, don't want to accept certain things. And what began as a very positive process in the long term may have actually become extremely divisive and not necessarily counterproductive, but that came with a lot of risks and came with a lot of damage. I was wondering how you might embark on this process that we're talking about, but doing in such a way that binds as many people in society into it, as opposed to it becoming a dividing line in society.
I think this is a very good remark, and I would like to ask you, because I see there is another remark or a question, and then I would like to encourage you to answer.
Great event. I'm Isabella Tabarovsky from the Wilson Center. And my question is, I was really moved, Iryna, by your presentation in particular, and your appeal for people to embrace the diversity and complexity of their past. And what I'm wondering about is, I think that some of the initiatives, or sometimes people believe that it's up to somebody else to do it, and there are different levels of memory. There's state memory, there's collective memory, there's personal memory. And what I'm wondering about is, what could the people present here do to meet the challenge that you posed individually?
Давайте. Do you want to react? Я попрошу кожного,
якщо має бажання. I would like everyone to have their input if you feel like.
Should I speak Ukrainian or English?
Українська добре.
Okay.
Ukrainian will be fine. Many years ago, when I first hosted some visitors in the city as a Lviv resident, I was asked the questions about the city I was not prepared for. The history that I learned in school and that I learned from many other sources, sometimes the underground sources my parents learned from, it was only a part of the true history that didn't really meet the requirements of the people that were bringing here. Then I realized that I have my job, my profession. This is a literary scholar, and I'm teaching students. I'm teaching them about the European literatures of the 20th century. Back then, I really dared to risk and take a different approach. Why would I teach them about the European literature somewhere else, like in the UK and in France, in the Netherlands? Let us have some literature which is related to Lviv. This could be the literature that was written here, composed here, and could be connected to some stories we are living through. This could be the literature that could help us. These are the books that could have been written, but they have not been written, and we are missing them. So I reconstructed the entire curriculum, and I analyzed several generations of students, and I do believe that they have a more complete life, and they have this image of Lviv in their heads, which is more complicated. It's comprehensive and contested, but this is also the experience that helps us reach the horizon of expectations on the basis of the experience, because it shows that we used to have some children before us in this place, and we know nothing about them. But this is also a very important question, and this question has been raised many times by the Ukrainian literature, but it was really subtle. We had the poet Hrytsko Chubai, who lived in Lviv. He was coming from Volhynia region, but he came here to study at the university and stay there. In the end of the 1960s, he composed a very strange poem. As soon as they built a city, and the prophet Jeremiah was already crying over it. He was crying over it as over the city that has been made empty for a long time. This allusion was very risky because he was living in the atheist society. And also, he was talking about crying over the empty city, which was full of people at that time. And these poems, these lines would pose many questions to the people who lived at the same time. Each of us, individual, even though we believe we might not be experts in politics or history, we're just the naive residents. Each of us individually is doing something or can find the way to do something to make this city closer to ourselves, so that the city could become fully, completely understandable in terms of comprehending the sufferings and the experience it has. Even though this is not our personal experience, but we could interrupt it. We could be more sensitive to some of the concerning signs before it is too late to stop them. Because the discussions that are going on in Poland, that Mr. Davies mentioned, we can experience the flashback, the backlog and the reverse to the efforts we applied. Even at these points, we should realize that we were doing a great job. We are confident about what we have done, and we should continue and pursue. This is not an easy job to do, and it is really demanding, but this is something that makes us more human.
Anybody else?
We're just addressing... Addressing Mr. Davies's question, I mean, we're acutely conscious of what you are saying, and every human action has unintended consequences. We know that from our own lives. Some of you will know that there is a theory that the very invention of the concept of genocide protection of the groups has reinforced the sense of group identity and given rise to a greater prospect that genocides will happen. It's one of the great ironies, and I think that argument has some legs to it. So we know that by opening up this debate on how one engages with the past, you expose yourself to these kinds of consequences. I think as an outsider, I would say I have to defer to those who are from the city and the community who will have the best sense on how to do that. But let me just give two brief anecdotes which illustrates, I think, the reality of what you are saying. The plaques that are going up tomorrow include references to the universities attended by Messieurs Lauterpacht and Lemkin when they were young men. If you take Raphael Lemkin was a student at the Jan Kazimierz University, at the law faculty of the Jan Kazimierz University, which has now become the Ivan Franko University. What do you put on the plaques? Do you put, as I understand to be the case, that Raphael Lemkin was a student at the Jan Kazimierz University, open brackets, Ivan Franko University, close brackets? Or do you put that Raphael Lemkin was a student at the Ivan Franko University, which is not true. He wasn't. So I've had conversations with friends, good Ukrainian friends, who have said, you have to put the Ivan Franko University, that he was a student there. And I'll say, but it's not true. It's not accurate. Why do you insist on saying that? And the response that I get is because if you put that he was a student at the Jan Kazimierz University, you will encourage people in Poland who want Lviv back. I have no answer to that because it's so out of my sort of expectation or sense of, you know, reasonable belief of how people think, that I just shrug my shoulders and say, well, you decide. But the second anecdote, which again raises the sentiment, I think, that sometimes the best is the enemy of the good, concerns the memorial. Sofia knows the story that I'm going to tell. There is one stone from the memorial that records the words of Inka Katz, who at the age of 12 watched her mother being taken away. And I recorded with a tape recorder her words, which were, my mother was taken by Ukrainians and Germans. That's what she said to me, so that's what I put in the book. The fact that she said it to me doesn't mean that it's true, although I have to say she seemed to give a pretty accurate account. And I put it in the book. I was then asked, and hugely applauded the fact that I was asked, who would I choose to send some words to put on stones? And I selected Inka Katz. It had touched me very much, her account. And eventually the words that appear on the stones say something like, they took away my mother. Now, I really understand, and it's sort of a hint about what I said before, that for a country that is newly independent, these are really sensitive, delicate issues. I mean, it's why I said in the United Kingdom, there's no public proclamation about its contribution to the great act of slavery or to colonialism, which has caused, misery for millions of people around the world. So an English person or a French person can hardly come to Ukraine and say, oh, this is what you should do and this is what you should put. That is a matter, I think, for the local community to decide, given your point, that if you put that up, that's going to be desecrated, probably pretty quickly. So is it better to be historically accurate and to record the actual words of Inka Katz on the one hand, or is it best to do things a little more incrementally, not be inaccurate, but not completely reproduce what was actually said if completely reproducing what was actually said is going to give vent to the forces that want to cause it. Now, reasonable people will answer the question differently. It goes exactly to the point you're raising. But it's the reason why when people I trust and respect in Lviv tell me it's better to do it this way for now, I'm not going to second guess that. That is not my role to do. But your question is really well put. And I have a certain fear that, you know, an outsider who comes out, who writes a book, who tells things and then is happy to see a plaque or two go up, is unleashing other forces which will have nefarious consequences. So your point is really well understood.
Okay, I have a little comment on that, but before we got to Professor Davies.
Very briefly, as Philippe says, it hardly behoves British or French or anybody else to tell other nations how they should deal with these difficult problems. I just wanted to say that most countries in Europe have similar problems. In Great Britain, one of the most painful episodes which was condemned to silence for nearly 100 years was the war between Britain and Ireland. At roughly the same time that Lviv was in the throes of its conflict with Poland. And it was only a few years ago, I can't remember, 3, 4 years ago, that terrible events that happened a century ago were, if not healed, at least addressed by Queen Elizabeth II, who amazingly went to Dublin for the first time. She said hardly anything, but she was wearing a dress in beautiful Irish green colours. It was the equivalent of her coming to Lviv wearing a dress in blue and yellow. And that symbolic event healed wounds which had been festering for nearly a century. Similarly, it was only 20 years ago that the Queen of the United Kingdom met with the President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, and the two women stood in silence at a point where tens of thousands of Irish soldiers had died as members of the British Army. And that was something which the Irish themselves had found great difficulty in remembering. So we're all struggling, racking our brains to find the right way to address these problems. But they must be addressed.
Yeah. Я думаю, що на цьому.
Thank you. I think that at this point, in this kind of final concluding summary, you know, yes, there are questions we have to ask and questions we have to look for answers. I would urge us to remember that there are different things, you know, great and small, and no cause is too small. We can say we lack a museum of the 20th century in Lviv, but even the moment when we see someone who comes here and asks to, you know, come into an apartment to see the birthplace of their parents or you know, grandparents, this is even that could be this micro act of courage and humanity. I think we must and we can also conceive of the specter of our actions, beyond the policy of national memory, beyond the politics of national memory that allows all of us to be actors. And perhaps then, we don't know, but on this very local level, perhaps we can see changes and shifts that will be hard to reverse. Courage, strength, work, and as well as vulnerability and sensitivity. I think these are these small steps that we can build upon in a city, but not only in the city. I would like to thank everyone who were at this panel, and I would like to thank everyone present in this room. I hope that we will see you tomorrow, at least some of you tomorrow at 1900 at the Lviv Philharmonic, and we can say that almost 600 people have wanted to come and listen to the story presented to us by Philippe with different actors and different presenters. And I think this is also a sign that something good is happening in this town. Thank you very much, and have a pleasant evening.
Awesome.